Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for The Science of Graying. Is it possible to turn back time? I'm Greg Berry, Director of Communications in the Office of Alumni Affairs. Since we're virtual today, please excuse any technical issues or glitches that may pop up. If you experience problems with your video or audio, click the reconnect button to get back to the webinar quickly. As we begin, I want to go ahead and ask a quick question. Where are you in the graying process? Your hair growing gray? Maybe you're just starting to get a few flecks of gray in your hair and are early in the change, or you're more gray than your original natural color. Perhaps your hair has completely changed, or maybe you're on the complete opposite side of things and you haven't started the process at all, or you just might be in denial and unwilling to admit that your hair is or will go gray. We're going to go ahead and keep the poll up for a few moments for you to submit your answer. And I see a lot of jockeying around there. For our guests in the webinar room, this session is being recorded. A replay will be made available on our website by tomorrow. Also, have a question, drop it in the chat throughout today's presentation. We'll have time for Q&A at the end. I see things starting to settle down in the poll. I'm going to go ahead and close that right now. It looks like most of our attendees, about half of them, are just starting to turn gray. There's a few flecks in their hair. Second biggest answer, more salt than pepper at this point. Thanks so much for taking time to participate in our poll as we begin. So at this time, I would like to introduce today's guest. We're excited to have Dr. Melissa Harris with us. Dr. Harris is an associate professor in the UAB Department of Biology in the College of Arts and Sciences. She is a two-time graduate of the University of California, Davis, where she got her bachelor's degree and earned her PhD before completing her postdoctoral training at the National Human Genome Research Institute. At this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Harris to the webinar series and turn things over to her. Thanks so much for spending time with us this afternoon.
Hi, Greg. Thanks so much. It's actually really a pleasure. I always like talking about our favorite topic, the science of graying. And so if it's all right with you, I'll just go ahead and take it away.
You bet. Let her rip.
Okay, thanks. Again, everyone, my name is Melissa Harris. I'm an associate professor over here in the Department of Biology. We just moved into the new science and engineering complex. If you haven't had a chance to come visit, you definitely should. We have some pretty cool cutting edge new research space. And that's where we are doing all of the work within my lab. So it's not just me within my lab. I wanted to highlight, I actually work with a team of individuals, and I affectionately refer to them as Team Hair Us. This is obviously a play off of my last name, but it says a little bit about what we do. The fact that we look at hairs essentially day in and day out, because we are interested in technically the topics of stem cells and aging. And I'll tell you why. But when we talk about stem cells and aging, the model that we use lends us to this idea of hair graying, because there's a specialized stem cell there that I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about today. So what I'm hoping to do for this seminar is just touch a little bit about how hair goes gray. What do we know from my point of view? And then address this question, which I think Cher made possible or made famous, I think, in one of her songs. Is it actually possible for us to turn back time? So as I just alluded to, my lab is really not just interested in gray hair specifically. We are interested in stem cells and how they age. So you guys may be familiar with the idea that in our adult bodies, we have several actually different stem cell populations. We have some, let's say in our blood, in our bone marrow, and that bone marrow, those stem cells, when they divide, they make new blood for us over time, our red blood cells and our white blood cells, and this is essential for us for life. We have a lot of stem cells within our skin. Our skin stem cells, when they divide, they're going to give rise to new skin cells as the old skin is sort of sloughed off over time as we are constantly, in the presence of this rough sort of environment. And the idea about our stem cells is this is their job. They just sort of sit around in this, what we call undifferentiated state. And what they are meant to do is just simply divide and give rise to these new kinds of tissues. And this is particularly important in conditions where we need to combat just normal tissue wear and tear, or if we want to help regenerate tissue after injury. So this is the role of our stem cells, and they play this important roles within our body. So now in the context of aging, unfortunately, our stem cells, like many of the cells within our body, are not immune to the forces of aging. So some of these stem cells are lost, some of them disappear, some of them are no longer functioning. And that actually includes a very specialized stem cell that we see within our hair. This specialized stem cell is called the melanocyte stem cell. And this is the stem cell that we need in order to maintain the production of the pigment of our hair over our entire lifetime. But many of you, actually, based on that poll that Greg just did a minute ago, know that this actually doesn't totally work the way that it's expected to, because a lot of us will lose pigment within our hair sometime within our life, and not even just at the very end of our lifetime. And actually, if we look across the world, epidemiological studies actually show us that hair graying is one of the most prevalent phenotypes or traits that are associated with aging. And when I think about this, I actually think that gray hair as a stem cell trait, or a stem cell trait for stem cell loss, is actually kind of inevitable. So if we look at the epidemiology, we see that over 90% of people will have gray hair by the age of 60. And so to me, this means that almost all of us are going to face this at some point in our lifetime. And it may not be a lot of gray hair, but it might be a little bit of gray hair. And so the reason that we're interested in studying gray hair is because it is really this fantastic model for us to understand how stem cells decline with age, and then ask, is there anything we can actually do about that? Okay, so that is what my lab predominantly focuses on. So let's talk a little bit now about the nitty-gritty of how gray hair actually happens. So how does gray hair occur? So this image that you see on the screen right here is meant to depict like the upper layer of your skin here, and you have hairs that are embedded in your skin. If you look on the left side of the screen, you can see that there is a pigmented hair there. And at the upper portion of the pigmented hair, you can see this little area, this little niche is what we call it, where we harbor some of our stem cell populations that are important in the hair. We actually have two different kinds of stem cell populations there. Stem cells that divide to grow the hair itself. And then we have our stem cell that we are interested in, the melanocyte stem cell. And these melanocyte stem cells, their purpose is to divide and then give rise to those cells at the base of the hair or the bulb of the hair to make what we call a pigment cell or a melanocyte. So it's these pigment cells or melanocytes that have this very specialized ability when they differentiate or they gain their function to actually produce pigment, and they reach out these little arms and they deposit this pigment into the hair shaft as it's actually growing. And so as that hair shaft grows from the hair follicle stem cells that produce the hair cells themselves, those melanocytes will pigment those hair cells that we call keratinocytes, and then that hair shaft will grow out pigmented. Okay, so it's maybe not totally surprising to understand how this can turn gray. So if you lose those melanocytes that produce the pigment, or you lose the melanocyte stem cells that give rise to the melanocytes, that is when you will get a gray hair, because obviously we're not depositing pigment into that hair shaft anymore as it's growing out, and as it grows out, it comes out non-pigmented, or what we just colloquially call a gray hair. So how do we look at this in the lab? We actually look at a lot of these hairs underneath the microscope. And so here is just an example of what it really looks like when we say, what is an actual gray hair? So on the left side of the screen, you can see a microscopic image of a pigmented hair. So the base is where all of the melanocytes or those pigment cells are going to reside. In the middle portion, you can see a pigmented hair shaft. And at the very top, you can see all those little dots. Those are all going to be our melanocyte stem cells. So that's what we would expect to see in a pigmented human hair follicle just under the base of your skin. In the next two images, sets of images under B and C, you can see this is what it would look like to see a gray hair. So these are hairs actually that look kind of literally grayish. At the base of the hair, you can see we have a reduction in the melanocytes. We have less pigmentation within the hair shaft. And in the stem cell area, we have very few melanocyte stem cells. And if we move all the way to D and E, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that a non-pigmented or white hair has almost no melanocytes and almost no melanocyte stem cells. So this is what we mean in the lab when we talk about gray hairs, these ones that are gray or white that have this reduction in melanocytes and melanocyte stem cell populations. So this is really the idea of how gray hair happens at sort of the cellular and tissue level. But some of you may be interested, well, how does this actually cause, or what causes this in the first place? And so when we think about that, we actually split gray hair into really two categories. On the right-hand side is age-related gray hair. Age-related gray hair happens about after 30 years of age. So anytime after you turn 30 is what we would consider age-related gray hair. On the left-hand side, anything before 30 is what we consider premature gray hair. So let's just address premature gray hair first. So when we think about premature gray hair, there's a number of different kinds of risk factors that can cause our hair to go gray early. This includes environmental factors like smoking, high levels of radiation exposure like a nuclear bomb. If you take anti-malarials like chloroquine or chemotherapeutic drugs, these can all be risk factors to produce gray hair prematurely. If we look in adolescence, a lot of times we see an association between nutritional deficiencies and premature gray hair. And this is usually associated with vitamins in the B complex, as well as minerals like calcium and ferritin, or deficiencies in these minerals like calcium and ferritin. There is also a strong association for premature gray hair if anybody else in your family also has premature gray hair. And then finally, there are a handful of genetic syndromes, and most of these genetic syndromes are premature aging or progeria syndromes that have gray hair as one of their characteristic traits. Most of these progerias actually are mutations in genes that are required for repairing our DNA when it is damaged. Okay, so that is what we believe to be the major risk factors for premature gray hair. But when we talk about age-related gray hair, really the biggest risk factor is age in it of itself. However, there's a lot of variability in what we call the frequency and intensity of gray hair with age. So the frequency is how many people will get gray hair at a specific point in time. So like those that are 30 years old, like how many will have gray hair? That can be variable. And then the intensity is how much gray hair you might get, like 10% of your hair would be gray or 30% or so on and so forth. Okay. So frequency and intensity of gray hair with aging is actually, variable based on a couple of things that we know of. The first one is gender itself. And some of you may be aware of this, I think, just sort of colloquially. If we just look out across the world, we actually know that the incidence of gray hair is 8% higher in men than it is in women. This is interesting to me as somebody who is interested in biology of aging, because many of you may know also that women tend to live longer than men. We don't exactly know why, but I make one guess having to do with gray hair. Actually, gray hair in men is a risk factor for myocardial infarction. So this is particularly in men. You see a little bit of this happen in women as well, but predominantly in men. Frequency, intensity of gray hair with age also is really dependent on what we call our ancestral genetic background. So to me, when I talk to my kids, I say, this is like where your people's people are from, your ancestral lineage, essentially. And we believe there's going to be a number of different genes that play a role in our ancestral genetic background that make us all a little bit different from each other. One of those genes has been identified as IRF4. If anybody's interested in that, I can talk about that a little bit later. But actually, what most people are usually interested in when I talk about this ancestral genetic background is, where do they compare in, if you look at other people from different countries and things like that. I always find this sort of interesting. So I put together for you guys just a map of the world and what we know epidemiologically about the frequency and intensity of age-related gray hair in this cohort of individuals, so 46 to 65-year-olds. So we just pick this one age cohort, which is about when we start to see a lot of graying happen. And then we can kind of compare across all of our ancestral genetic backgrounds. So while I'm talking, you can look for your own individual background in here, but I'll just give you some of the highlights. So If we look at the lowest levels, actually, those individuals that have an ancestral lineage that is sub-Saharan African, they actually show the lowest frequency or the fewest people that get gray hair within this particular cohort. If we look at individuals that have an ancestral lineage that is Chinese, they have the lowest intensity of gray hair at this particular age time point. On the flip side of that, I hate to say this, I always feel so badly when I talk about the flip side, the highest, who has the most frequency. That's actually where we go to our European descendants over here. If we look at individuals that have an ancestral genetic background that is French, they have the highest frequency of gray hair at this time point in life. So 93% of people will show some level of gray hair between 46 to 65. And if you're Scottish, you have the highest intensity of gray hair. So this is what we would see as age-related hair graying around the world. And you can see there's a lot of variability with everybody else sort of in between those two boundaries there. And we believe there's a lot of genes that play a role in making these differences in the frequency and intensity of our gray hair. So I think maybe one of the major questions that I get from people actually, when I tell them that I study gray hair, is they're like, well, that's cosmetic. Why should we care about that from a scientific point of view? And yeah, sure, it is a cosmetic phenotype that we're studying. But when we look actually about, or when we think about why we should care about gray hair, I went and did some market research and I found out that the global market for hair dye and hair coloring is actually gigantic. It's forecasted to reach 42 billion by 2025. So this is just next year, actually. So this suggests to me that actually I'm not the only one that cares about my gray hair. A lot of people care about their gray hair, and this is across the world. And some of us may be just interested in covering up because we like the way that it looks, but I'll tell you, I get emails day in and day out from individuals where they say their quality of life is affected by the way that they look. They didn't think they could get the job that they wanted because of their extensive amounts of gray hair, particularly more in women than in men. And so it's clear to me that even though this is a cosmetic trait that we have, a lot of people do care and value this trait because it does contribute to their quality of life. But there are other reasons for me as scientists why I care about gray hair, and it has to do with the utility of this particular model for studying stem cells and aging and a way to study stem cell rejuvenation. And in my opinion, actually, melanocyte stem cells and hair pigmentation provide an unrivaled model that we can use for both the ease and utility of studying stem cell populations in adult organisms. And I'll give you 4 different reasons why I believe this. So the first thing is, which is really why it's a problem for us as humans, this phenotype or this trait of gray hair is visible on the outside of your body. And that's why we kind of care about it from a cosmetic point of view. But actually from a scientific point of view, that is fantastic because that means that we can go, we use mouse as our major model to study gray hair. We can just go and we can open the cage and we can say, hey, what color is the hair? We don't have to do anything invasive. We actually can quantify a lot of this graying using high resolution photography. We have this little photo studio that we use to take these high resolution pictures of our mice, so this is a fantastic trait or phenotype for us because it is visible on the outside of your body. So that's number 1. The second reason why we care about this as a scientist is that we can actually activate melanocyte stem cells simply by plucking the hair. And that's what's on the diagram on the current slide. So on the left-hand side, you can see that most of our hairs, let's say our body hair, are in this stage that we call telogen. This is just the dormant stage of the hair. So like your eyebrow hairs, your body hairs, all of those that aren't actively growing are in this sort of dormant stage. So we can actually pluck one of these hairs. And when you pluck the hair, what happens is that hair follicle is now activated to regrow a new hair. So this includes activating our hair follicle stem cells to make the hair structure itself. as well as activate the melanocyte stem cells, which are those purple balls over there. And those melanocyte stem cells, when they become activated, again, they're going to divide. They're going to produce those pigment cells, which are in the little green stars. And those pigment cells are then going to start to differentiate and produce the pigment and deposit it into the hair shaft. So in the middle of the screen, you can see that hair shaft growing, and now it's pigmented to make that new pigmented hair shaft. That growth stage is what we call the anagen hair stage. And then after the hair is done growing, actually what happens is the lower portion of the follicle regresses. It goes under this regression stage that we call catagen, and then we can start the whole process over again. Okay. So as a scientist, this is really cool because we actually know the timing of when all of these steps actually occur. So I can pluck the hair and then I can wait 7 days. And I know at 7 days, we should be at that mid-growth stage, and I should know exactly what those stem cells are doing, or if they're not doing that thing they should be doing. So that makes it a really fantastic model for us. And some of you guys may have, if you've plucked an eyebrow hair this morning, might have actually set up this experiment in your own skin just today. Okay, so that's the second reason why we think this is a fantastic model. Third reason why we think this is a great model is that when you look at this picture, you can see that those stem cells are actually very close to the top of your skin. And so that makes it a really unique tissue for us to be able to treat with drugs using topical therapeutics. And so we can just slather some cream on there and we can see what it actually does to that stem cell population. This again is very nice because it is non-invasive. So we do actually have a lot of brushes and ways in order for us to apply topicals to our different mouse models to understand how these stem cells are affected in response to those different kinds of drugs or therapeutics. And then finally, I did mention a little bit that we study mouse. Mouse in and of itself is a very great genetic tool that we can use, and that makes it a really nice way for us to study like this entire package, melanocyte stem cells and hair graying and all of the processes that happen. So that is why we love this particular model to study melanocyte stem cells. Or to study stem cells and aging, rather, is what I should say. So one thing I want to point out, even though we use mouse as a model, it's actually not exactly the same as humans. And that's something that's kind of important to understand, actually. So thinking back to that diagram that I just showed you of the hair cycle, we go from telogen, which is the dormant stage, to anagen, the growth stage, and then the regressive stage. So if you look at a mouse or actually any furred animal, so like any animal that has a furry coat, like a cat or a dog or a hamster or the body of a horse, all of those have really short hair. And the reason they have short hair is because their anagen stage is very short. So if you see there on mouse, it says the anagen stage is only 13 days. This is important because then that means those melanocytes, like if you look at the hair follicle diagram, those melanocytes at the very bottom are only going to be producing pigment for 13 days, and then the hair regresses, so those melanocytes are gone after that. So that means we only had to rely on them for 13 days. So that's not a very long time. It's not a lot of time for those cells to be affected by aging. But in humans, actually, it's different if we want to talk about hair that grows for a long time, like let's say your scalp hair. And when we talk about having gray hair, we're not generally talking about our body hairs or our armpit hairs or things that we're not really paying attention to. We're talking about the ones that people can see. So like predominantly our scalp hair or our facial hair. So for our scalp hair, actually, the growth stage of the scalp hair can be on average 2 to 8 years in a human. So this means those poor melanocytes down at the bottom of the hair bulb there have to be constantly producing that pigment as that hair shaft keeps growing and growing and growing. And this has to go on for years. And so this suggests that part of the reason why we get graying in humans is because we're also affecting that melanocyte population, as well as we could be affecting the melanocyte stem cell population. So now let's talk about some of the cellular mechanisms that we know that are important in maintaining, or actually maybe the other way around, that can cause loss of stem cells or loss of melanocytes. And I don't want to get into too many of these details, but if anybody has questions about these specific genes or processes later, I'd be happy to address any of those questions. Okay, so in this idea that we can affect either melanocytes or melanocyte stem cells, I just sort of separated on two different slides the major ways in which we can drive graying by affecting one or the other cell population. So we're going to start just with melanocytes. So one of the things actually that we have seen for melanocytes, so they're supposed to be producing pigment, is sometimes actually those melanocytes, for whatever reason that we don't always know, they just stop producing pigment. They don't disappear or anything. They just, I don't know, maybe they get tired, something like that. We call this disrupted differentiation. So they're there, but they're just not doing their job as they should be. Okay. So that's one way in which we could then get gray hair if the melanocytes aren't producing pigment. On the lower diagram there, where we see the little arrows, melanocytes are also really sensitive to what we call oxidative stress. So oxidative stress comes in a lot of different forms. I mean, just general living, our cells functioning produce oxidative stress. Exposure to the sun produces oxidative stress. And so a combination of those factors, plus, if your body has an impaired antioxidant defense system, this can also be stressful for melanocytes. And in human melanocytes, actually, with age, we see a lot of signs of oxidative stress in all of the what we call macromolecules within the cell. So our DNA, our RNA, our proteins, all of those are showing some signs of oxidative stress before those cells are eventually lost. Okay, so those are general mechanisms for how we could lose or stop melanocyte function. We also have several mechanisms that can affect the melanocyte stem cells. So for the top one over here, apoptosis, that just means cell death. So our melanocyte stem cells could just up and die, which is not great. Sometimes we get melanocyte stem cells that do what we call premature differentiation. Remember, our stem cells, their job is to just stay undifferentiated, divide to make new melanocytes. But if they instead turn into melanocytes themselves, that doesn't help us because they can no longer divide after that. So sometimes we see that happening, and there's a number of genes and pathways that drive this particular process. And then finally, the last one that I want to mention is what we call failure in melanocyte stem cell maintenance. So the way that our stem cells usually work is it divides to make two cells. One cell is going on to make a melanocyte. The other cell is meant to be the backup, should stay as a stem cell that could then divide again. However, if both cells decide, oh, I want to be a melanocyte, well, then that becomes a problem because you no longer have a backup. So actually, there was a lot of press about this particular idea because it was shown recently or proven recently that acute stress can actually cause this failure in melanocyte stem cell maintenance. And the way this works is that if you have like a really extreme stress that happens in this context, in this model that they used, it was exposure to capsaicin, which is the stuff that's spicy in peppers. So if you have a huge exposure to capsaicin, what happens is around our hair follicle, we have all of these nerves, and they release a huge amount of these neurotransmitters. This somehow freaks out our melanocyte stem cells. They activate inappropriately, they fail to maintain, and actually kind of in a cool way, some of them just like migrate away. They're just like, oh, we're not going to take this anymore, and they leave the area. This leads to eventually a loss of the melanocyte stem cell population. So some of you may not be surprised, like it's always been thought that stress causes gray hair, but this was actually the first real report showing on a scientific level that it could happen. Although I think all of us can appreciate that it seems so obvious that it does if you just look at any of our recent presidents, and I use Obama, poor Obama, as the example, because he went into his presidency with very little gray hair. And then by the time he was finished with his terms, came out with significantly a lot more gray hair. So combination of stress and age is what I'm guessing happened in that context there. Okay, so we talked a little bit about how gray hair happens, some of the risk factors for gray hair, differences between age-related and premature gray hair, and then some of these more nuanced molecular mechanisms. But really, where I really want to talk about is take some time to address this question. Gray hair reversal, is it actually possible? And so this is my field, and I am pretty, straightforward kind of person. And I actually, without any sort of embellishment, I actually believe that this really is going to be possible sometime in the near future. And I'll just give you a couple of reasons why. So let me just point you to this study first. So you have probably actually seen this in your own hair, potentially, or somebody that you know has shown you a hair. If you look at the diagram at the top, that starts out pigmented on one end of the hair, gets a little bit less pigmented, and then towards the center of the hair, it's gray, and then it gets more pigmented again. Okay, we call this essentially like a transition and then a reversal. So you've seen a hair, probably one individual hair, where it could have like a portion of gray and then repigmented again. So this idea that individual hairs can go back from pigmented to gray and then back again actually literally exists. And there was a whole study to measure this, even though I've seen it. A lot of people have seen this. But from a scientific point of view, this is very interesting to me because it suggests that that pool of melanocytes that are down in the hair bulb can be negatively affected over time, over the course of anagen, that growth phase. So they could stop working, but that this doesn't necessarily have to be permanent because you can actually see the pigment coming back again. So I was kind of interested, what kind of products are out there that could actually promote this possibility. And I'll give you a disclaimer here. I'm not a physician, so I'm not recommending this. If you guys are interested, this is something you should definitely talk to a medical professional about. But I was actually personally interested because my daughter actually has premature gray hair, which is very ironic because I started all of this research way before she was actually born. But anyway, I was kind of thinking about, what are the mechanisms that could cause gray hair reversal? Can we learn anything from the products that currently exist on the market? And there was one in particular that caught my eye. It's from this company that's called Array. Array means to arrest in French. And they have this product that is called Not Today Gray. And I was attracted to this because they had this testimonial from Jay after using 8 months of Not Today Gray. And he shows a beard hair where literally one end was gray, but the new part that's growing out of his face has grown back dark brown again, his natural hair color. So this here, we can see exactly that this possibility can happen. So I was curious, well, what is it exactly that is in Not Today Gray that could be promoting this effect? So long story short, if we look at the whole top of what this supplement contains is a whole slew of vitamins and minerals, and a lot of these at higher amounts that are generally recommended for your sort of daily dosage. Okay. So I went into the literature to look and see, well, what is this about nutritional deficiencies and causing gray hair? And I'll have to say, unfortunately, what I found is that really in the context of age-related graying, there is not so much literature showing that any of these vitamins or minerals can affect that process. The only place where there's an association of gray hair reversal with vitamin supplementation is mostly in adolescents who've had premature gray hair because of some sort of nutritional deficiency, okay? But this has been, an idea really for decades. I went back, I found this review by Winter in 1991, and even at that point, there was a lot of skepticism in the field about vitamin supplements for gray hair reversal. And he actually says at the bottom of this quote, "We don't care. No, eat it, drink it, shampoo with it. We don't care. Just buy our pantothenic acid," which is one of the things in Array Gray's product, "and have thicker, fuller, stronger, more pliable, healthy hair." So there's been a lot of skepticism about vitamins and minerals for the purposes of anti-aging kind of effects. Okay, but that's not the reason actually why I was showing this. One of the reasons, or the reason why I was interested in Not Today Gray is actually in their proprietary blend. You see there's a handful of other things that they have in there. And one of them at the very end is called Foti root. So Foti root caught my eye because in the literature, I am aware of this plant, Polygonum multiflorum. So Foti root is essentially an extract that comes from this particular plant. This plant is a tuberous plant that's native to both China and Japan. And for centuries, extracts of this plant have been used for its pro-longevity, anti-aging, and gray hair reversal effects. Okay. So I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting because I've actually read a little bit about Polygonum multiflorum within the literature. And there are more than several papers showing in a scientific way that Polygonum multiflorum extracts can actually induce the process of pigment production or melanogenesis. And not only that, but they can also reduce the effects of reactive oxygen species. And so this is just some of the papers that I've seen more recently, let's say within the last decade, that have been interested in Polygonum multiflorum. So from my point of view, and I'm thinking about, like my own family member, my daughter, what would I want to do? I think Polygonum multiflorum has a lot of promise. However, I want to give one sort of public service announcement before you start going onto Amazon to order your own extract of Foti root. This is a plant where these extracts come from. And as of just 2015, I guess this paper was published, they've identified approximately 100 different chemical compounds from this plant, some of which we believe have those pro-longevity, gray hair reversal kind of effects, and others of which, like emodin, which you see on the right-hand side, which can actually be toxic if you have in too high amounts. So I think for me personally, I may wait until we can identify the specific compounds that have positive effects and separate those from those that have negative, but I think there's a lot of promise here. So when I ask the question, gray hair reversal, is it possible? Or when people ask me this question, my answer is I actually feel kind of optimistic when we think about how we could affect melanocytes themselves, okay? But my research is actually not focused so much on melanocytes. My research is focused on melanocyte stem cells. So I wanted to ask the same question, gray hair reversal, is it possible by affecting the stem cell population? And here we also have some interesting research that has happened. So in this picture, what I'm showing you is an image of an individual that went in, got a medication, went into his treatment with gray hair, came out with black hair. And the treatment wasn't for hair color at all. This was just a random side effect, but he had complete gray hair reversal. So to me, this suggested that maybe in our gray hairs, we actually harbor some residual melanocyte stem cells. And if they're there, somehow we can actually reactivate them. So that's what I took out of this set of images here. So this set of images actually came from a clinical case report that was published several years ago now for these individuals. And so this is just two different examples of patients. Unfortunately, these were patients that were undergoing immunotherapy for lung cancer. But the immunotherapy that they were using was targeting one of two proteins. One protein was called programmed cell death 1, or the other protein was its ligand, programmed cell death ligand 1. And you can see here, the patients went in for their immunotherapy with gray hair, came out with totally pigmented hair. Just so happens in this sort of fortuitous way in which science works, we had been studying PDL1, or that programmed cell death ligand 1, because we had found in our mouse models that some of our melanocyte stem cells actually express this particular protein. So if you look at the graph in the center part of the slide, you can see in young animals, so animals that are 10 weeks old, and we're talking about mice here. So this would be a really like early, very, very young adult animal. The white bar shows all of the melanocyte stem cells that we have, and the little gray bar at the bottom shows that some of them express this PDL1 protein. With age, so now if we look at a 2-year-old mouse, which is quite old for mice, you can see that the overall population of melanocyte stem cells decreases by at least half, but that PDL1 population seems to be retained. And so we had this crazy idea, well, maybe there's something interesting about these PDL1 positive melanocyte stem cells. So perhaps our stem cell pool has several different kinds of melanocyte stem cells. Just so happens those that do not express PDL1 as we age, those ones get depleted for whatever reason. Those ones are lost, but those ones that have PDL1, that maintain PDL1, those are retained, but for whatever reason, they're not working because they're not producing pigmented hairs. And so you can see a non-pigmented hair with one stem cell left. So what we think is that when these patients go in and you block that PD-L1 protein, it somehow kicks that stem cell back into gear and allows it to make new melanocytes to repigment the hair again. Okay, so that is sort of the hypothesis, and we've done a lot of work to question or to address this to see if this really is feasible. And I have just a little bit of data that I'll show you here. So here we actually can make mice gray, and then in this context here, we can treat them with two different kinds of controls. So our vehicle is one control, our IgG is a different control. But then if we treat those mice that are gray with a therapeutic that blocks PD-L1, you can see that they are significantly less gray. So it reduces both the intensity and the variability of gray hair in our gray-haired mice. So we think there actually is something to this hypothesis, and that is one of the major projects that we've been working on in my lab. So we come back to this question again, gray hair reversal, is it possible? I actually feel even more optimistic, and I feel like we're actually getting really close. We understand a lot about melanocyte stem cells and melanocytes, how they work in the context of the hair. And so my hope is over the next decade, we have some real actual therapeutics for gray hair reversal. So now some of you may be thinking like, you know, I don't mind my gray hair at all, right? It's just on my head. It's not really doing anything to me necessarily. You know, are there other reasons that we should care about studying gray hair? And I'll give you just one reason. So in the context of aging, one of the major traits that happens is age-related muscle loss or sarcopenia. And this is actually a big deal. If you lose a lot of your muscle mass, it makes your mobility very difficult. You have a higher risk of falling. This is, to me, like one of the things that I would hope to not have is sarcopenia. But what is interesting from a scientific point of view is that if we go and we look at the muscle stem cell population, we found some evidence to suggest that there are some muscle stem cells that express PD-L1. So we would hypothesize that these stem cells may work in a similar fashion as our melanocyte stem cells, and we could somehow harness those PD-L1 positive stem cells, reactivate them the same way in which we believe stem cells can be reactivated in the context of that immunotherapy that I showed you earlier. So that is one reason why we like to use this stem cell population. It's very accessible for us, and it allows us to ask these kinds of questions. Whereas if we were studying muscle stem cells, that's actually significantly, technically much harder. And then finally, I just want to leave, I want to just sort of summarize, or not even summarize, but just leave you just with this one thought. You know, we do study this cosmetic phenotype. You know, is there any benefit to just staying gray, just going gray, just like living into it, you know? And actually, there actually can be some benefits depending on how you want to think about it. So if we compare the average diameter of a non-pigmented or white hair and a pigmented hair, we can see that white hairs are actually larger. And so if you feel like your hair is thinning, keeping your hair non-pigmented will actually make it feel a little bit more lush because those hairs will be just a little bit bigger. Also, and some of you may know this colloquially, gray hairs actually grow faster than pigmented hair. So white hairs grow faster than pigmented hairs. And sometimes I've seen people with sort of like gray eyebrow hair that all of a sudden is like super long. That is the reason for this. There's something about melanocytes that change the dynamics of how our hairs grow. And so having them actually keeps them shorter and smaller. So with that, I just want to introduce you to my team. So these are almost all of my members. I actually added 2 new people. These are both current and past members of Team Hair Us. My mission here at UAB in the Department of Biology is really twofold: to inspire and train these guys in the art of rigorous collaborative and collegial biomedical research. But together, I hope I give them this excitement by this vision that we can work together to identify real biological solutions to combat tissue aging, starting at the level of the hair. And so with that, I'll conclude and take any of your questions. Thank you all for your attention.
It's just fascinating information. And I love the passion, and I'm sincere with that, of that you have for this topic. We do have questions coming in, so I want to get to those.
Okay.
And I apologize. I'm not a health guy, so some of these, if I mispronounce a word,
that's okay.
And the first one may get me stumbled. This person's interested in thoughts on catalase. The idea is that it breaks down hydrogen peroxide. They tried catalase shampoo, which seemed to do nothing. Is it a thing?
I mean, at the cellular level, yes. And so if we go back to the slide that showed that your melanocytes can be affected by oxidative stress, that whole balance between your antioxidants and those that cause damage, that's an important process. And it seems like in the context of aging, melanocytes will show that DNA damage. Whether you can get catalase into your hair follicle in such a way for it to have an effect, not 100% sure about that in a shampoo format. If you had the cells on a dish, that would be different, you know? So it would maybe depend on some of this formulation. But the idea that increasing your antioxidants to decrease the oxidative stress, I think from a biological point of view, is a good idea. And as we age, those antioxidant defenses go down.
And just to kind of recap in a way, hair doesn't turn gray. Hair is gray. It just doesn't get colored because it does not get pigmented. That's what somebody picked up on. Is that?
Well, technically, you could have a hair that had only half the amount of pigment as you normally would, and we may visualize that as a grayish hair. It might look kind of gray. I think people want to think of hair as either being completely black or completely white. But if you look, there is actually a range of colors you can get in between, but people don't generally pay too much attention if they still have color, how that color compares to all of the rest of their hairs. Does that kind of make sense? So we sometimes don't look at the middle range so much. It's either it has it or it doesn't have it. But technically, I believe you can have a gray or a half-colored hair.
Gotcha. Okay. Does MI risk factor correlate to percentage of gray hair?
So you're talking about the fact that individuals with more gray hair have a higher risk for myocardial infarction. So yes, if I'd have to go back and look specifically at the study of how much gray hair, but I think they ranked it based on like a little amount of gray hair, like 10%, moderate amount of gray hair, or fully gray hair. So in the moderate and the full gray hair, you have a higher risk for myocardial infarction. In men predominantly, it's not been studied in all demographics. Women also show a trend, but it's not statistically significant.
And this one's tongue in cheek a little bit. So plucking gray hair doesn't necessarily mean that two are going to grow back. So that one.
No. And actually plucking, to be honest, actually, if you have, let's say partial gray, salt and pepper, plucking a gray hair technically could activate your stem cells. You might get a newly pigmented hair in that spot if you still have melanocyte stem cells left.
Interesting.
So if anybody does that experiment, take some before and after pictures.
Are vegans with B12 deficiency at risk for graying?
That's a good question. I have not read specifically about vegans. However, you don't see a whole lot of literature in adults with nutritional deficiencies. Mostly it's focused on adolescents. I'd have to go back and look very specifically for that. But, you know, to be honest, I imagined I would have seen it if it existed.
Is there a correlation between early graying and other early onset aging symptoms like wrinkles, arthritis, and some other things?
The only place where I see this is in individuals that have premature aging syndromes like progeria. So that's the only place where I can really point out, yes, when you have premature gray hair in that context, you will also get all of the gamut of the rest of the aging syndromes or the aging traits. I have to look. I don't want to say, I cannot remember if there's anything with like more gray and more wrinkles all at the same time. Although I can say that there is an association with environmental factors like smoking causes premature gray hair, can also increase wrinkles. But I don't have enough data I'd have to go back and look.
Sure. Do red hair people turn gray?
Yes, absolutely. Red hair people also turn gray. It's just sometimes a little bit harder to see. Most of the epidemiological studies that I find to be good ones, they actually have a whole unique way of being able to assess your original hair color and then the grade of graying. It's a whole science actually for measuring graying in an accurate way to take into account your original hair color.
What is the latest age you've seen someone begin naturally graying?
The latest age. I mean, I think in that one graph I said, 45 to 65, 90% of people will show some level of gray hair. So that would suggest that 10% of people after that time point haven't yet gotten gray hair. I don't think I've actually ever seen anybody say that in their cohort, 100% of people got gray. So there may be a chance that there are some individuals where you will never see it. But I'm going to say it's got to be less than 10%. And I would actually probably say it's less than 2%, something like that.
Are melanocyte stem cells the same ones that cause dark spots on the skin?
Not necessarily. So, there are spots that come from aging, that is predominantly going to be melanocytes within your skin are going to be the ones that are producing the actual pigment. Whether the stem cells will give rise to those melanocytes in your skin, I'm not 100% sure about that, but it is usually going to be the function of your differentiated cells within your skin that are going to make those dark spots.
Is there a positive or negative role for exercise in melanocyte stem cell survival or renewal? And would the type of intensity of exercise be the importance?
Okay, so I don't know directly the answer to this question, but I can kind of answer it in a circuitous way. So in the context of biology of aging, a lot of people look at diet intervention and exercise. Those two things actually in humans have shown, and across a lot of different species, have shown the most promise for their pro-longevity effects. And so having a low-calorie diet, so not eating too much, and then also getting daily exercise, both cause anti-aging or pro-longevity. When people assess these effects, particularly in animals that have hair or mammals, one of the traits that they often look at is gray hair, just as sort of like something that they measure: gray hair, wrinkles, your ability to move around, these sorts of things. And so all of those aging parameters decrease in this pro-longevity environment. So in a circuitous way, my answer would be most likely increased exercise, low calorie diet would probably also contribute to decreased graying in your hair.
What is happening in vitiligo? Are melanocytes dying? And I said melanocytes 3 times before that.
That's okay. Yeah, so vitiligo is actually something totally different. Vitiligo is an autoimmune disorder where your immune system sees your melanocytes as something foreign. And so anytime your immune system sees things that are foreign, it actually goes in and kills those cells or kills those parasites or whatever to get rid of it. And the problem is for vitiligo, like other autoimmune disorders, those immune cells are attacking your own body. And in this case, vitiligo, it's attacking your melanocytes.
On the topic of MI risk factor, is it within populations versus across populations? Since heart disease risk rate have been found increased in populations like Black and Asian with lesser hair graying frequency and intensity.
So I would say that the jury is still out. There was a couple of large, well-done studies that were mostly in a Caucasian population that shows the risk factor for myocardial infarction. And those studies I go back to because they were quite large, but they did not cross a lot of demographics. So that is one caveat. I think from a couple of those studies, plus maybe one other demographic, which I am not going to remember right off the top of my head, I'm so sorry. The risk factor is also there in that other one, but it's not been done worldwide as far as I know, has not been tracked.
So the person's curious about the one you mentioned that had gray hair and after treatment ended up with dark hair.
Okay.
They're curious if that dark hair was their normal hair color.
Oh, I think You know what? That's a good question. I believe that is their natural hair color. I have to go back in that paper to double check. I can't quite remember if they mentioned that or not, but I do think they say reversal to natural hair color.
And I'll have two more questions, then I'll let you go. Professor, you don't seem to have any gray hair, they say. Would you be willing to share using the product? Where would you lie on that poll from earlier?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So I'll tell you guys, my ancestral genetic background is half Caucasian, half Asian, and actually half Chinese. And so for intensity of gray hair, remember, we were on the low scale. So I might attribute my fortune in that way to that half of my genetics potentially. But then interestingly, I have a daughter who is 12 that has premature gray hair, and she has like at least 10-20% of her hair is gray. So super interesting. We don't know exactly why, but she's also on one of these nutritional mineral supplements right now to hopefully combat it. So we'll see if it actually works.
It is so just very interesting. My dad, I dropped in the chat early. He was gray by the time I think he was like 35, 40. I mean, he was straight platinum, as he would call it.
Yeah.
I have just started to get flecks in my hair. My brother has a nice bit of gray. So, and that's just three very similar people. So the last question I have, if somebody wants to volunteer, is there a way to volunteer with y'all?
Oh, you mean to give hair or to work on science?
Whatever you'd like.
We don't actually have anything at the moment, but anybody is welcome to email me. My email address is harrisml@uab.edu. You can find me also on the UAB Biology faculty webpage that has all my contact information there. I always love to hear from people. I've been tempted to try and do some sort of human study, just have to figure out what exactly we want to ask. But yeah, so just send me an email and I will try and respond and get you your answers.
Awesome. Dr. Harris, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it was a real pleasure.
Great to have you. And a quick reminder, a replay of the webinar will be uploaded onto our website by tomorrow. Live attendees will receive an email once that link is ready. In a moment, I'll highlight some upcoming webinars. But first, if you're in Birmingham, join us for Blazer Bingo at the Alumni House on Wednesday, April 10th. Registration is $25 and includes a book of 10 games with 6 boards each, finger food, and a chance at door prizes. We'll also have a cash bar available. Register online at alumni.uab.edu/bingo. Also join us as we support scholarships through the 18th annual scholarship run presented by Viva Health. Registration for this April 20th run is open at alumni.uab.edu/5K10K. All participants will get t-shirts and finisher medals. Again, that is at alumni.uab.edu/5K10K. And as promised, here's a look at some of our upcoming webinars. On Thursday, we'll welcome Dr. Stephanie Yates back for 50 money management tips, part of our Backpacks to Briefcases series. This virtual event will provide us with easy takeaways on how we can manage our money. Then on Thursday, April 11th, come back for The Science of Caffeine, Chemistry, Consumption, and Controversies, where Dr. Daniel Smith will explore all things caffeinated. On Tuesday, April 23rd, our final The Science of for the year, we'll be hosting The Science of Sleep from A to Z. Join Dr. Justin Thomas as we delve into how much sleep we actually need and the health consequences of poor sleep. And on Wednesday, May 8th, join us for Between a Breadwinner and a Caregiver. During this webinar, Mary Meadows Livingston will take a look at the struggle the sandwich generation faces. Register for these and more at alumni.uab.edu/events. Finally, let us know how we're doing, what kind of webinars you'd like to see. The QR code on your screen takes you to a very brief survey. Again, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. And as always, go Blazers.